Sodom, Lot being among them, and he not only conquered these kings, and by the way, what's interesting is that Abraham conquered these kings, and what do kings normally do when they conquer each other? They take their lands, don't they? They take their property. Whenever there's a vacuum, something has to fill that vacuum, and in the ancient times, if a king conquered another king, he took his land, took his people. Abraham didn't do that, because that was not Abraham's interest. Abraham's interest was only to get his nephew and his family, perhaps, that were with him, to get them back, and that's all he wanted. But in the taking of the spoils, Abraham kept nothing for himself. Abraham was not rewarded, didn't want to be rewarded for what he had done, but did say, whatever these young men have, whatever they want, let them take what they want. But as far as I'm concerned, I don't want anything. But he gave a tenth of everything to this man Melchizedek. He gave a tenth of it. All right, so now, that's a little bit of the history of this right here. It's interesting now that the Hebrew writer is bringing up Abraham. He's bringing up Melchizedek, of course, once again. And in verse 2 it says, to whom also Abraham gave a tenth part of all. First being translated king of righteousness, there's the name Melchizedek. And then also king of Salem, meaning king of peace. Now comes the sticky part, and I don't want us to get bogged down into the weeds here, because I do want to say this, however. If we were to keep on subject here, and the context, we're not talking about the man as much as we are talking about the order of his priesthood. That needs to be in the back of our minds or the front of our minds as we're approaching this, because the Hebrew writer is talking about priesthood. He's talking about priesthood. And so with that being the subject then whatever is stated in verse 3 has to be related to that subject, priesthood. And kingship, by the way. Because he was very unique in that he was a king and also a priest. It was prophesied that Jesus would be king and priest, by the way. In Zechariah, let's see what, I've got that written down somewhere. I do somewhere. I've got notes all over my Bible. Zechariah. I'll find it in a second. But Zechariah prophesies that Jesus would be seated upon the throne and would also be a priest at the same time. So now, in verse 3, it says, with regard to Melchizedek, without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor the end of life, but made like the Son of Man, and remains a priest continually. So now, we have two options. One is that we have a very old man somewhere here on the base of the earth. Right? Or number two, this is more in reference to a priesthood that he did not inherit, nor did his sons inherit after him, but that priesthood had neither a beginning and does not have an end. It is eternal. There is a nature about this priesthood that has always existed. You remember last week, maybe it was last week, it might have been the week before, we talked about the throne and the priesthood, that when Jesus was enthroned as the Son of David, he did not start a new throne. Now I can go deeper into that with relation to the kingdom, but we'll save that discussion for another time. All right, so then the throne had already existed when Jesus took the throne as the Son of David. Since he is both the king and priest, high priest, the high priesthood, the office of high priesthood, had to have also existed prior to Jesus becoming high priest. So when Jesus became the king, Son of David, he was seated upon a throne that had already existed, but that was eternal. when Jesus became the high priest, he became high priest in a position that had already existed. It was likewise eternal. Does that make sense? So then, in context here, without getting into the weeds of verse 3, and asking the question, does this refer to the man? Does this refer to his priesthood? Does it refer to both? We have to ask one question. Are we talking about a very old man that's never died? Or are we talking about a priesthood that's always been? And this actually, in the context, lines up more with the priesthood than it does with the man himself. Now, like I said, I don't want to get into the weeds of all of that because there can be a lot of disagreement there too. Because it does have language in there that seems to be more related to Jesus the person than Jesus the high priest. But let's keep it in the context of talking about the high priest, if you don't mind. And let's talk about the high priest now in relation to Melchizedek and the order, his order, the order of Melchizedek, which is very unique, unlike any other. The order that never had a beginning and it will never have an end. It's almost as if it was for a period of time suspended and waiting for that person to fill that position. Only that Melchizedek was put on the earth for the purpose of establishing to us, for us, its purpose. So it says in verse 4, but before we get into that, are there any questions or any comments in relation to that?
It always brings to mind to me Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, who was high priest of Midian, and he must have been a high priest to God because
That's right.
there he was on the mountain. It was he that pointed out who dwelt there.
Right.
And
That's
just another example of a priesthood outside of
That's right.
the genealogy of Aaron.
That's true. That's true.
And that also was before the giving of the law.
Very true.
It seems like Melchizedek, Jethro, and there were probably others. I don't know that Enoch might have been considered a high priest.
Good. It doesn't mention that, but it's possible.
First of all, I don't know what it means, but it says like in some of our words written, we say context, I'm not understanding, I guess they're in verses, but I don't know or understand. I've always looked at this very, very good, but I just don't understand.
Well, I'm in the same boat. And I've been studying this for years, exactly what does that mean? But I do know this, that it's in the context of the priesthood. I know that part of it. And I can easily relate that into the priesthood. Now, where it does say that it's like the Son of Man, and if you'll notice the phrase,
Mine says Son of God.
the Son of God, yes, I meant to say that. Like the Son of God remains a priest continually. It seems like that phrase, but made like the Son of God, remains a priest continually. It seems like that phrase, made like the Son of God, is related somehow to the priesthood because of that, the ending of that verse. Remains a priest continually. In that the Son of God is eternal, the priesthood is eternal. And Gene, I've been studying this for years, and honestly, I still am not quite satisfied with my conclusions, except that it is in relation to the priesthood.
Now, if you consider who it's written to, they're going to have great difficulty with anybody being considered high priest unless they're of the lineage of Aaron.
They would.
And so he seems to me, he's pointing out that this has not always been.
And he's shortly, and because it's going to re-emphasize the new as opposed to the old. Unless there's any other questions, or you've got a better explanation that perhaps I can give for it. Verse 5 then. Verse 5, or rather 4, it says, now, pardon?
I would just say, it doesn't say he's the Son of God.
Right.
But it's, and I think you're right, he's comparing Christ to Melchizedek, and then they're turning right around and comparing Melchizedek to Christ.
That's, yeah.
In that, in that they are the only ones who held this position. Melchizedek is set up as this free runner, just like John the Baptist almost was a free runner, kind of in the immediate, but Melchizedek was a free runner from kind of the beginning of this one that would come and be priest forever.
Right. You know, bringing up John the Baptist as being the forerunner of Christ, Jesus didn't say he is Elijah. So it's not that he is Elijah, but he is like Elijah.
Right. He's holding this office, right, similar to what the Son of Man, Son of God, is going to hold.
So the common denominator is the priesthood.
I think so.
The high priesthood. Yeah. Very good. In verse 4 it says, now consider how great this man was, to whom even the patriarch Abraham gave a tenth of the spoils. And indeed, those who are the sons of Levi, who receive the priesthood, have commanded to receive tithes from the people according to the law, that is, from their brethren, though they have come from the loins of Abraham. So now, he's bringing in Levi, the tribe of Levi, for a purpose here, because this is once again going to make an impact upon the Jewish people in relation to Melchizedek. The point being is that if Abraham, who is the ancestor, the forefather of Levi, gave tithes to Melchizedek, and if Melchizedek was greater than Abraham, that necessitates the point that Melchizedek is also greater than Levi. And if Melchizedek, in terms of the priesthood, is greater than Levi, he's greater than Aaron, and Aaron's high priesthood. Can you see how this domino effect that he is setting up here is starting to make the point about which priesthood is superior? And then it goes all the way back then to the point that Jesus did not come from Aaron. If he had, he would have been from an inferior priesthood, but because Jesus was appointed to be high priest according to the order of Melchizedek, he therefore is higher than even Abraham. He is greater than Abraham. But doesn't that make sense when you read other verses in the Bible about Jesus and what he claimed about himself? When he made a statement before with regards to Solomon, for instance, a greater than Solomon is here, right? With regard to Abraham in John chapter 8, what did Jesus say to him in relation to Abraham? Before Abraham existed, he said, I am. I am. So that says that Jesus, he's already established the fact that Jesus did in his teaching that he was greater than Abraham. Well, the high priesthood that Jesus has benefited authority to is greater than Abraham. Greater than Levi, greater than Aaron. So there's the point. This is all the point right here that we're trying to bring out. And of course, they need to know this more than we do, because we never lived under the law of Moses. So we didn't have to struggle with that difficulty. Okay, it says in verse 6, it says, but he whose genealogy is not derived from them received tithes from Abraham and blessed him, who had promises. Blessed him, that is Abraham, who had promises. Now, beyond all contradiction, the lesser is blessed by the better, or you might even say the verse 8 is a little bit confusing. And honestly, I had to read it from another version or two to kind of get a little better understanding about what he was talking about here. But I'll just explain what he's talking about. In verse 8, he is comparing the priests, the high priest, who lived and died. He had a life, he lived that life, and he died. His sons then took over, lived, each one, lived, died, lived, died, lived, died. They were mortal men, and these mortal men received tithes. But there, talking about Melchizedek, going back to Melchizedek, there Melchizedek received those tithes, or rather, received those tithes, of whom it is witnessed that he lives. And once again, it is a priesthood that did not cease to exist. It is a priesthood that continues to live on. And so in verse 9, he says, even Levi, who receives tithes, paid tithes through Abraham, so to speak. Reiterating simply that Melchizedek is greater than Levi, although Levi had never been yet born. For he was still in the loins of his father when Melchizedek met him. Does anybody have any questions about what we've just covered? Like I said, we're getting kind of deep here, and there's a lot of just head scratching, I guess we could do, getting into the weeds. Do we have any questions or anything with regard to this? He's simply, in a very difficult way for us, trying to say Abraham, the order of Melchizedek is superior. The priesthood of Melchizedek is superior above all. Above all. And that's what he's trying to get across. All right, verse 11. He says, Therefore, if perfection were through the Levitical priesthood, or under it people received the law, what further need was there that another priest should rise according to the order of Melchizedek? See, here's a rhetorical question he raised. The rhetorical question is, if a person could be made perfect, and being made perfect is being made right with God, by the way. That's one of the things that since Adam, that mankind has wanted to be made right with God. And the question was, how can I be made right with God? That's the question. All right, here comes the law, but there's a problem with the law. The law in and of itself cannot make a person right with God. Now that would beg the question, okay, since that couldn't make us right with God, what was its purpose? Can anybody tell me its purpose?
To bring us on to Christ.
To bring us to Christ. That's Galatians chapter 3. Galatians 3 in verse about 24 says that the law was given in order to bring us to Christ, that we might be justified by faith in Christ.
He also says that how would I have known sin if it were not for the law?
Yes, the law exacerbated what sin is and does. Sin has always existed, but when the law came, it magnified it. It's like putting a magnifying glass on something and making it bigger.
So to put a magnifying glass to the two greatest commandments. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself.
Right.
To put a magnifying glass on that. And even at that, it was still attitude twisted, perverted.
Sure. So the law was not intended to make a person perfect. You could not, if you wanted to be, all right, so let's look at it this way. If you sinned once, you violated one commandment, what does James say that the person is guilty? And talking about the law, you're guilty of the whole thing. You're thing comes down upon you. One sin, one violation, the whole law, the mountain of that law comes down upon you as being guilty. So then, I want to get out from under that mountain of condemnation. So is it possible for me to, if I sinned against one sin against the 313 commandments, and can I now do the 612 perfectly to try to get myself under that one sin that's brought condemnation? Is that possible? The Jews, I think, kind of had the idea you could. Because and Muslims do the same thing. By the way, Islam is nothing but another form of Judaism. That's all it is. So the Muslims believe, as did the Jews, that when you get to the judgment, you just hope that the scales are set so that your good outweighs your bad. And you're actually allowed into paradise.
Which is an impossibility because it is a complete change that we have to go through. If you consider Romans chapter 6, dying to sin, and we become a new creature. This was the whole intent of the sacrifice that Jesus made, that those sins would be washed away so that we could be made perfect, not to live in it any longer. So the idea that you had crud up 40% of your life and 60% live more righteously, therefore you're going to heaven, you're still in opposition to God.
Right. So you're emphasizing the impossible. It's not only illogical, it's just impossible to do it. And so then he's saying there for the Levitical system could not make one perfect. All right, so now let's go into what can make us perfect. What God did in order to make us perfect. For what further need was there that another priest should rise according to the order of Melchizedek and not be called according to the order of Aaron? Continuing this rhetorical question. For the priesthood being changed, of necessity there is also the change of the law. So if you've got the priesthood that's under Aaron's priesthood, you have the law of Moses attached to it. So since the priesthood was done away with and another order was brought in, you could not bring the old with it. You could not bring that old system over with it. How many of you have heard of premillennialism, dispensational premillennialism? All right, most of us have. If you haven't heard of dispensational premillennialism, part of that teaching is, I'm going to go through all the details of it, it's too complex. Part of the teaching is to believe that the temple in Jerusalem will be rebuilt and that the Levitical system, the sacrificial system, will be reestablished with the priesthood and with its priesthood. Now, how contradictory is that with what the Hebrew writer is saying right here? What that is actually saying under that teaching is that what we have now is imperfect, but what is perfect is coming. And when Jesus comes, he's going to sit on the throne, the temple is going to be built, and the sacrificial system is going to be reestablished. That's the Levitical system. That is saying the Levitical system is the way in which we are made perfect. And the Hebrew writer says, no, it isn't.
No, it's through Christ.
It's only through Christ. And you can't put Christ on the throne and justify the animal sacrifices either. Christ is the end of all sacrifices. He's the end of it. So then he says that necessity. Then he says that the priesthood being changed, of necessity is the changing of the law. Changing of the law. Now, one of the things that we need to be careful of doing is this. Yes, what Jesus brought was a new commandment and also a new law, but it's not like a law system. And that's very important. I think many times what we've done is that we have taken a legal system, which is the law of Moses. We've taken a legal system and we've made the law of Christ a legal system. What does a legal system do? It It punishes the violator, which is the only thing that it can do, right? It's the only thing that the legal system can do. So now we have the law of Christ, and it is called the law of Christ. So fulfill the law of Christ. By the way, what is that law? Love one another as I have loved you. That's the law of Christ. Summed up in that. So then, the law of Christ is not a legal system. The law of Christ does have commandments. It does have, you might say, regulations. It has laws. But there's something built into this that is not in the law of Moses, and it is grace. I'm not saying that I'm not trying to say that God did not express grace to people who were under the law of Moses. You go to the book of Leviticus, and I can show you where grace can be found, but it didn't come by way of the law. It came by way of what God did when Jesus came, and God said over here, He says, you do this, you're justified. That means forgiven. That means absolutely made right with God. But it wasn't by the system by which they were made right with God. It was because of what God was going to do that this was a shadow, and what would be a shadow of the reality of the cross. That's a totally different subject.
And to understand the law, the freedom from protection, the protection, under the law. Today we have a law against murder. Doesn't stop murder. A law against stealing.
That's right.
Doesn't stop stealing.
That's right.
It is a effective one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you know, we understand what law is. We understand what law is. And all that law can do is condemn the violator, like Joey said. Has no way to deal to make the person right. Now, with Christ, we have the ability to be made right with God. So there's the difference. There's the difference. Okay, so now, there's a change of the law. In verse 13 it says, for he of whom these things are spoken belongs to another tribe, from which no man has officiated the altar. What's he talking about? He's talking about Jesus. Jesus was another tribe of Levi. Right. All right, so it is evident that our Lord arose. But always has been established and always been there, who has come not according to the law of the fleshly commandment, but according to the power of an endless life. For he testifies, you are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. This, by way, is an oath of God. God never made an oath to Aaron saying, you will be a priest forever, fill in the blank. God never said that to Aaron. But he did say this to the Messiah. So there is an oath that God has made with regard to this priesthood that establishes it forever and ever. It will never end.
Darrell.
Yes, sir.
It's also, you may have already said this for the Kingdom Lake, but in Psalm 110, verse 4, it's prophesied beforehand. The Lord has sworn and will not relent. You are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek.
Right.
Right. What was foreshadowing what was to come.
That's right. David wrote that. Psalm 110 is the most quoted messianic psalm in the New Testament. It is so filled and rich of messianic prediction. And one of the two places in the Old Testament, only two places that Melchizedek is mentioned. And the third place is here in the book of Hebrews. So there's very little, but enough. Very little, but enough. Anyone else?
So for these Hebrews, it's being pointed out in this chapter that priesthood of Aaron was not established until the law was given.
Right.
And because of the change of law, it must be that priesthood is done away with.
That's right.
And so therefore it no longer exists, and those who are thinking they want to go back to that, they're going back to nothing.
Going back to something that doesn't exist as far as God is concerned. Exactly right. Yeah.
It's kind of like putting one wine in the wine skins, isn't it?
I think that's what Jesus was implying there. I really do. I think he was implying that. Yeah.
Why do you think people keep wanting to go back to the Old Testament law when we're
That's-
no longer
Well, I
lack
think-
of knowledge, or
Well,
Same reason we would.
I sort of was going to go there. It's the only thing they knew. It's the only thing they knew. And so it's the one thing they did understand.
it's cut and dried, so it's
It's very, very, very cut and dry, and it was visible. You went to the temple, you saw the sacrifices. It was it appealed very much to the senses that we trust. But this appeals more to faith than it does to sight. That's one reason why it was so hard to grasp. And so that might be one reason. Now, going back to the typical thing about what we tend to do is we tend to go back. How many revert after they've come to Christ and they've been Christians for a couple of years, but they revert back to their own ways and they go back into the world?
comfort.
Well, same reasons.
Or those who grew up in the church with certain traditions that really were not consistent with Scripture, but they have to hold on to that. That's got to be required. That's got to be expected. How you dress and
Sure, right. Yeah. Yes. You can apply that in so many different ways. Good questions and appreciate your comments. So I really wasn't expecting to finish chapter 7, but we're pretty close. We will next week. It's going to be cut dry next week. One thing that will be